Welcome to the Broken Pie Chart Podcast, episode 83. I'm your host, Eric Moore, and today we're going to be talking about the election. Do presidents matter? What are the returns for different presidents, Democrat or Republican? Some really interesting sort of anomalies have come up recently with the construct of the House, the Senate, the presidency. And with me today, a special guest, Spencer Wright from Halbert Wealth. Spencer, how are you today?
Derek, hi, I'm great. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here and have a chance to talk about this today. It's a fascinating subject, and I hope we can do it some justice.
Yeah, and it's interesting because 4 years ago, we probably were on the phone. We're not going to do 2 hours today, but we were probably on the phone for 2 hours.
At least.
And we were we were kind of just going back and forth, not only handicapping the race and looking at the states, and we'll do some of that a little bit later, as well as the Senate. But we were talking recently, and I said, before we get too in depth, why don't we just have this conversation? We'll turn it into a podcast. So thanks for joining us today.
Oh, sure.
And, I think we'll start off here. And it's the question of, and I'll have a link I'll update some of this data and I'll put it on the site. I'll put it in the show notes. But it's the question of, do presidents really matter when it comes to investment returns? And one of the things that we've been doing is we've been looking at, I guess we could turn it into do presidents and the Senate and the House. And I'll start here, and then I'll sort of turn over to you for some thoughts. But 1923 through August of 2020. And why did I only go 23? Well, I did this by hand, going back and looking at some of this stuff. And, the 1800s, you had the Whigs. But Triple R, Triple R, Republican president, Republican Senate, Republican House. It's happened 15% of the time in the last 97 years. Average annual return, 16.5%. And Triple Ds, Democratic majorities across the board. And, just under 14%. That's actually been 35% of the time. Spencer, does the president really matter? I think this says otherwise.
Right. The president matters to the extent that the president is an embodiment of ideals and policies and desires. And can those policies and ideals and desires be converted into legislation? Can they actually affect the country in various ways? And in order to do that, of course, they have to have a compliant Congress. Interestingly, though, I think a compliant Congress is not necessarily one of their own party. In many ways, divided government is best, has been best for the markets. Wall Street certainly likes divided government because they feel like that nothing will get done or nothing drastic in either direction, and that maintains a status quo that the economy and markets in most times are just fine with. But if you look at when a party is controlled everything, you would think that it would lend itself to a result that is on one extreme or another. But as your analysis shows, and I found this to be fascinating, there's not much difference.
There's really not. There really isn't. And we could look at sample size and we could say, you look at this construct, and to give the listeners a little context on this, there have been periods where it's been one or the other for quite some time. 1933, give or take a few years, all the way until, let's see, really the 50s. Mm-hmm. Roosevelt certainly had all three, had supermajorities. But then we look at, some of the other times. Coolidge looks like during his presidency. But then we have the other ones where I think, you pointed to in a prior conversation, Eisenhower,
right.
Republican president, mm-hmm. And then Clinton. I think all of his years he had Republican Senate and Republican House. I could be wrong on that. And both constructs were pretty good for the markets.
Right. When you think about, so what would maybe consider a golden era of certainly of peace and prosperity. You think of the 1950s post-war era under Eisenhower, and you look back at that as being just an enormously successful presidency, a successful period in American history. And Eisenhower had a Democrat Congress, Senate and House, his entire 8 years in office, and yet, things still got done. Um, I don't know if they were everything Eisenhower wanted or everything the GOP wanted. Certainly not. But it was a productive period. And a modern analog to that, as you rightly point out, would be the Clinton era. When you look back on it, Clinton's market returns are frankly staggering when you place them against other presidents. But there are a lot of reasons for that, and market returns aren't necessarily the providence of an executive, of a chief executive. I think that they can help in that arena. They can certainly help in that arena and create conditions where a market can thrive, and they can also create conditions where a market can be stifled. Though I don't think they have the capacity in and of themselves or through policy to completely eradicate a strong market or to uplift a truly bear market. But Clinton, had Republicans the entire time.
Actually, first 2 years he had Democrats, which is another point. Yeah, that sometimes that doesn't hold. Yeah.
But didn't get a lot done. Obama, for example, had a full Democrat slate early on, and came into office with a tremendous mandate, and was a very dynamic candidate, and had ideas that were as large, I think some would say, as what FDR had. And he was not able, even with his congressional majority, to enact, I think, some of the things that he'd wanted. So having a majority is no guarantee of success.
You bring up that point. It seems like in the recent history, I guess you look at the first 2 years of Obama, where he had all three. It's kind of similar to, Trump he's running for re-election, obviously, but the first 2 years had the majority. And, this doesn't go into the margin of majority, but it's almost like each of them got one shot. And Obama got healthcare done. Trump got taxes.
Right.
The big legislation. But it is interesting that with Obama and with Clinton, the first 2 years, on the way House and some of the elections work, you can have this for 2 years, but then you have the midterm, right? That sort of turned.
If you look at the Clinton era, and I'm old enough to have a very good memory of all of this. Clinton was more productive on a legislative front after Gingrich and the Contract with America cohort took control of the Congress. He was more productive with it. Why? Well, Clinton enacted most of the Contract with America legislation. He had Dick Morris whispering in his ear, saying, this is pretty good stuff. Clinton was a Southern governor, always had his finger in the air, consummate politician, and was a more perhaps middle of the road by today's standards, and said, okay, but moreover, I'll enact these things. Sure, I'll do your things. Great, we did them all. Now I have some things I'd like to do. Let's do those. And that met with a lot of resistance. And Clinton said, oh, no, well, that's not going to do at all. That you're hammering my effort. I was in good faith. I did your stuff. We're not going to do my stuff. And of course, then they ran on the do nothing Congress, turned them into bogeymen. And not long after coming around, Gingrich and his types found themselves, marginalized. The majority wasn't lost, but it was enormously decreased.
Give you a couple numbers here, Spencer, and I won't go all the way back, but give you some, Obama, the average annual, the compounded annual. Okay, so let me little market speak here. When we say simple average, it's just you take up all the returns, you divide by that. But the compounded growth rate is what an investor would actually experience, right? Now. The reason why I didn't do compounded growth rates for, let's say, when it was triple R or triple D is you can't compound when you have 1950 and 1980, right? So I'll just give you some compounded annual growth rates here. Trump through, I think I did this last week, plus 12.7% annualized. Obama had a compounded a CAGR, CAGR, compounded growth rate of 14.28%. George W. and negative 2.86. We'll talk about him, though, and timing when we talk a little later about timing of. But Clinton was plus 17, H. Bush 15.5, Reagan 14. Carter, surprisingly, was plus 11.5. And then you had, Nixon, Ford. I don't know how to. I mean,
that's a very tough one to reconcile.
Yeah, I mean, Ford had plus 30% in 2 years, but Nixon, Kennedy and Johnson, we'll call it around, average of the two, around 11%. Of course, Hoover during the Depression. Anyway, so I think it goes to our point, and it also goes to timing. But a lot of these presidents are similar, although GDP growth, Obama was about 1.6, Trump's going to change, but this is through July, 2.3. But Reagan and Clinton are really the comparables, 3.9 for Clinton, Reagan 3.5. But anyway, I mean, it's really similar across a lot of these presidents. But I got to be honest. I mean, if I'm a president, I want to be taking over at the end of a recession, or I don't want to take over. I mean, George W. Bush takes over in January of 2001. At the beginning of a recession. But yeah, I mean, but I to your point, I think a lot of these folks, the results are really similar. By the way, markets go up over time.
They do. Yeah, markets, as you know, are affected by the concept or the notion of positive drift, right? Markets are affected by positive drift and negative skew. And if markets weren't affected by positive drift, if that did not exist, the first massive collapse and correction that occurred in 1667 would have been the last. That would have been it. But that's not how markets operate. And they do go up over time. What I found interesting, of all these numbers, Carter's numbers are not nearly as bad as you would think they would be. And there are other things that, those numbers, of course, don't tell the whole story because, inflation was very high and confidence was low and people felt like they were in a tremendous malaise, I think was the term was used back then. But just the GDP numbers, frankly, aren't that bad.
Yeah, and those are real GDP. So for our listeners, that's if you have 10% inflation and GDP grows 10%, your real growth is zero. That's real GDP growth of 3.3%. Yeah, that was astonishing to me. Anyway, I know it was to you.
Yeah, so Carter was doing a 3.3% GDP and was ejected from office by the American voters. Obama, now we look back on it, of course, doing about 2%.
I mean, 1.7 if you round up, yeah.
2 was perhaps generous. 1.7% and was reelected, and they often refer to the fact that he was the architect of one of the greatest economic recoveries ever. Which the numbers, I don't care what kind of party you're in, but the numbers just don't bear that out.
Isn't that fascinating? That Carter only had 4 years, Obama had 8, but Carter's numbers not quite as high of a compounded growth rate, but. By the way, it's also interesting if we forget pairing Nixon and Ford. If you take Ford's final 2 years, which is, 2.6 GDP growth and 30% annualized, and again, it's his sample size is really small. But if you do sort of the lineage Ford-Carter, that's a pretty good 5.5 years. It's fascinating, right? I mean, how inflation was 15%.
Right. That really, if you took the 6-year stretch of Ford Carter, even with inflation being in double digits, the results, frankly, were not bad at all. In fact, the return years, the S&P under Ford, although again a small sample size, was incredible. So and Carter, not as great, but not bad.
No. Of course, then you have, it's interesting, because Reagan has the recession really early on in his term.
And a lot of people forget that, but there was a recession early on.
A bad one, and Volcker jacked up interest rate. Jacked up is not the right word. He raised interest rates, right, to beat inflation. He did that. 82 interest rates crested. I mean, you could have bought a 30-year bond at 15%, but you actually look at Ford, Carter, Reagan, H. Bush, and you're talking about, obviously we had really bad recessions. Carter had high unemployment, high inflation. But yeah, that was sort of, you mentioned Eisenhower, from a market standpoint, Ford through Clinton. I mean, which by the way, was the greatest bull market ever in history, which is 82 to 99. The market went up 1,000%.
People think that's interesting you bring that up, because I think people look at the current environment and they say, well, the market, even after the recent action in Q1 of this year, that things are getting back on track, and this is still a great, the greatest bull market ever. That's not exactly true. I mean, how do you measure these things? By longevity? Well, it's not even the longest in U.S. history. People forget that period you just quoted. I don't know that we'll ever have a period like that again. Maybe we will, but the one we're on right now is nowhere near as virulent as the 82 to 2000 period.
Oh, I full agreement, and I don't have it handy, but cyclical. There's a difference between measuring from the trough, the low, to the peak, the high. But you look at when you exceeded a prior peak, and there's nothing even close to that period.
No, it was. I don't know. There's repeatable now. Of course, along the way, people say, well, they want to chop it up into more discrete pieces and say, well, the crash of 87, truncated a bull market, and then another one began. And okay, yes, that goes to the cyclic activity you spoke of. But on a larger, backed out macro view, you could easily say, this period is one large bull phase with three significant mean reversions in 87, 2000, and 2001. Which is more or less how that played out. And then we entered a new bull phase, around 2009, after the final very large reversion in 2008. But when taken together, as scary as 80 of all those, by the way, 87 was the worst as far as actual damage done and everything else. Even though it may not have been one of the larger percentage drops, it was by far, and I think market-wise and economically, the biggest hammer that fell. But if you look at 87, 2000, 2001, and 2008, those are natural mean reversions inside that incredible period, that 1,000+% period. Those are to be expected, those types of reversions. And now we were on a new one for the last 10 years, but it's not 1,000% run over the last 10 years.
No, but again, that run was different constructs of presidents, houses, senates, and I know one of the other things we wanted to get to as well is there's some interesting anomalies with, and they're more recent, so I don't know what this means going forward, but I'll throw out some numbers for the listeners, and then we can sort of have some discussion on it. A Republican president, a Democratic Senate, and a Republican House. Again, I only went back, I say only 97 years, but it's happened twice. George W. Bush, 01, 02, negative 16%, almost 17% annualized return. Let me give you some other ones here. Obviously, that was not, anyway, recession, 9/11, 2002. But then you go, President Obama had this has only happened 4 times, where you had a Democratic president, Democratic Senate, Republican House. And then just looking at some of the other constructs, those are not, well, this happened 10 times. I'll just refer to RRD. Reagan had a lot of those. Trump currently has it. And then the DRR. But here's one that's never, well, I shouldn't say never happened, because you have to go back to like Grover Cleveland in 1885 or 87. But if we did have a Democratic president, let's say Biden wins, and the Republicans keep the Senate, and the Democrats, assuming we keep the House, that has not happened since 1885, 87.
That's because those types of things, I think the environment that has to create that, those are, you have a national will or a desire that has elevated one party into the executive and one party mostly into the legislative, but you have regional issues that have kept one or the other house in the hands of the out party. And I think that could be the driving reason we see that and don't see it very often, is because in many ways state, federal, local issues sometimes, and certainly in general elections, find themselves in alignment, but not always.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think, we have to go to margin and things like that. All right, so let's talk about, I think we went through some of the historical things, and like I said, I'll post this in the show notes. And I was surprised by some of it, not surprised by others. But I do think it's interesting that if Republicans hold the House, it would be like somebody said, well, we'll get to the Senate later. Do I think that's going to happen? I said, well, it would be the first time in a while. Let's talk about Professor Alan Lichtman came up with this thing. He wrote a book, I think it was in the 80s, and I'll sort of explain what this is, and then we'll go through it. I've got these. So he writes a book. He does a lot of research. I think he's at American University. I could be wrong on that.
I think that's correct.
Yeah, which is right in or outside DC. And so he writes this book called The 13 Keys to the White House. And what he does is he has these 13 things that he looks at. And if you have an incumbent, if 6 or more are false, so like, for example, I don't want to go into it yet, but midterm gains in the House, if that's false, the incumbent doesn't get that check mark, the challenger gets it. And so I've listened to interviews on this. He said it's for the popular vote. I don't know if he's changed anything for the Electoral College, because and last time what he did was he went through, I read an interview, and he predicted Trump would win. Although I think we'll get to the keys. So we haven't done, I got to be honest, I'm familiar with these. I know generally, but we'll have some discussion about, some fine points on this. So, Spencer, let's just go into it. Let's go through the keys, and let's try and come up with who's going to win this thing based on the keys. And then I want to look at the map too a little bit later, but so one of the first keys is midterm gains in the House, which means, did the sitting president, so did Trump's party pick up more seats in the midterm elections? The midterms were 2 years ago. Spencer, obviously this is no.
Yeah, clearly. No, they did not. And so you have to put that in Biden's column according to this method.
Okay. No party contest to the incumbent. And I guess that probably means like a Pat Buchanan or a Reagan when Ford was running type deal, right?
Right. There was no credible challenger to the president. No. So that's one for Trump, I guess.
Yeah, that's one for Trump. Am I right though? Isn't it Buchanan and Reagan were the two?
Well, as far as the spoilers go, if you want to talk about spoilers, there were 3 major spoilers. I was going to include Ross Perot, but we're talking about primary politics here.
Yeah, we're talking about the president. Like when Clinton was office, no Democrat went and seriously challenged him. Yeah. Okay.
So Pat Buchanan was certainly the major spoiler in recent memory. I mean, he even won New Hampshire, as I recall.
I think so. I think that's right. And then, but Reagan against
Reagan against Ford. I mean, so Reagan, Reagan and Buchanan were the two main challengers that I can think of. The Democrats really haven't had any credible challengers.
was Kennedy, President Ted Kennedy, did he run against Carter in the primary?
He did run against Carter in the primary, and then he refused to endorse him.
Oh, maybe there's something to this 13 case. Okay, so we've got 1 versus 1. Okay, I'll keep track of this as we're going. Does the person running for election, are they the incumbent? Obviously, Trump is the incumbent.
Power of incumbency is fantastic. There's so many advantages, as I think people saw last night. If you watched the RNC, being the incumbent has tremendous advantage. Potential Logan Act violations aside, you have enormous power as the incumbent, and so huge. If these, I know they're equally weighted. I think there's no one has more weight than the other. But if you were to weight these things, incumbency has to be near the top.
Yeah, for any number of reasons, you essentially not only are you unopposed normally in your primaries, we just talked about that, but as you said, last night, Trump got to give a speech at the South Lawn with fireworks over DC. Anyway, so yeah, obviously incumbency. Here's one. So no third-party candidate is predicted to get 5% or more of the vote.
Right, and I think that's true. And in recent memory, I think this only happened twice. In 1980, going back a little bit, John Anderson, who was the Libertarian candidate, or the Independent Party, not Libertarian, Independent Party candidate at the time, received nearly 10% of the vote in 1980, which was quite interesting.
I forgot about that, Spencer. That's right. I remember him in the debates. He had the black rimmed glasses, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, kind of very professorial. But Anderson received a substantial portion of the vote. And then, of course, in 92, you had H. Ross Perot.
Perot is fascinating. And the fact, God, we could do a whole podcast just on that. I don't want to go too far down that path, but if people forget, he dropped out of the race and then came back in. Like
He did. He left and then he came back with pie charts and everything. But that was a very interesting development. And people say, did he cost Bush the election? Well, Clinton was elected on a plurality. He got 42% of the overall vote, which was enough through the Electoral College to see him elevated with a substantial Electoral College win. And so, again, obviously, you don't need a majority of the popular vote to do well in the Electoral College. And that is absolutely by design.
But certainly the fact that he got more than 5%, in this case, I think we both agree, well, there is a Libertarian candidate. I don't think most people know her name. I'd like to see more people in debates, but no, Trump certainly has that key as being true. All right. Maybe we'll come back to the economy because I think there's some open-endedness there. So incumbent administration affects major policy change. Have we seen major policy change by Trump? Taxes, right? I mean, that's the big one.
Yeah, tax. Yeah, exactly. Huge tax reform, corporate and personal. Mostly, I think corporate was the one that was the most impactful. Prior to Trump taking office, corporate taxes were 36.5%, which were the highest in the world. Which is why you had, companies like Apple and several others creating these bizarre, offshore entities in Ireland as a type of tax haven to avoid paying those taxes. Well, people keep saying we want them to pay their fair share, then that's fine, except that when you're large enough and powerful enough and have the resources, you can escape paying taxes if you want to. as all of these companies demonstrated. But when you lower the taxes to a point where it's no longer feasible to do that, revenues theoretically can escalate because there's no benefit in constructing these offshore entities, and the money returns home. But anyway, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole there. I'm sorry about that, but the fact is that was a huge shift. The corporate tax lowering of the corporate tax, the point they did was an enormous shift over the last 8 years.
Yeah, I would agree. We give that check mark to Trump. No scandal. So, well, without debating, yeah, we could, whether or not it was there. I would give this to Biden. I would say this is false. He did get impeached.
He did, and no matter what you may think, or what if you're a Trump supporter and you think it was all concocted, if you're a Democrat and you think that Trump is the worst thing to happen to Western democracy, the fact of the matter is that he was impeached, and I don't think that's so lightly shaken off.
I would say the same thing. If we were doing this for Bill Clinton, I would go the same way, and you could argue whether or not that was anyway. So we both agree there. No foreign military failure. I think I'd give this to Trump. How about you?
I think so. In fact, they've had, I suppose, some successes. He's reduced the U.S. footprint and has had success on a few fronts overseas without embroiling the U.S. in new large-scale entanglements. So, yeah.
Foreign military success. Originally, I was going to say Biden because, when you think about foreign military success, it's winning a war, winning something. There are people who point out to me, though, that ISIS was, pretty much, I don't think that's an ongoing concern anymore. But I think there's some debate here. He didn't, I don't know. What say you?
Well, they, by their own admission, certainly eradicated ISIS as far as we can tell. I don't know if you ever know for sure, but seemingly they've been at least greatly reduced, marginalized. They are reducing the commitment to Afghanistan. The commitment in Iraq has been completely withdrawn, and they've avoided, sending troops to Syria, engaging in other places where we might have done so in the past. And I think that he promised to do those things, and it speaks well in that regard. But larger than that, there haven't been any new large-scale entanglements, and I think that is very important. And I think Trump was right to run on the fact that, and to take the position that the U.S. is just weary of these external conflicts, to say nothing of the fact that they are extremely costly in lives and money.
I think you bring up a good point. I get the 13 keys, and obviously I get where Professor Lichtman's coming from, but it's almost like if you didn't get into any wars or didn't have any entanglements, then that would be a negative. That is a little.
I don't. That one. I don't know that I agree with. I think if you look back at Eisenhower. I mean, they would say, well, Korea. Yes, that was the beginning of, not letting the dominoes fall, but largely you avoid, and Clinton really, there were operations in Kosovo, but they were quite in the Balkans. They were relatively small scale. You avoid. If you avoid nasty foreign entanglements and nation building, that's the big one. If you can avoid nation building and foreign entanglements, that's a positive, I think.
So you're giving this to Trump. When I originally scratched this down on an envelope, I said I'll give it to Biden by the technical definition.
But I honestly think it belongs in the Trump column.
Okay. I'm gonna mark 1 and 1. We'll see if that's. I think you might have convinced me though, but we'll come back to that. No social unrest. I'm going to say obviously, yes. I would give this to Biden. It's false. Charismatic incumbent, and then I'll also throw in or a national hero. So like Eisenhower was a national hero. You brought him up. I mean, originally Lichtman gave this to Trump. Because he said, and it goes to an uncharismatic challenger. But let's start this time I heard an interview with him, and he actually did not give it to Trump.
Really?
This time. He gave it to him last time. But I'm still, I mean, he's a showman.
Yeah, I mean, charismatic. I mean, is he particularly inspiring? I mean, yes or no? I mean, it depends on whether you're a fan of his tweeting or not. I guess that could taken into it. But Trump knows how to build a cult of personality, and he has certainly done that. And maybe that's not the same thing as charisma necessarily, but I think that I would still put this in Trump's column, if perhaps only by default, because Joe Biden is, no matter your politics, you can't say that Joe Biden is particularly electrifying.
No, and that gets to our next one. I think we both agree. Well, I'm going to stay with Professor Lichtman's original assessment from last election. So we'll give that one to Trump. Uncharismatic challenger, yes. Joe Biden, President Obama, by all accounts, was very charismatic, good speaker. I remember him in Denver accepting the Democratic National,
Right.
the DNC's nomination.
I was standing in my kitchen. We had some friends over, and we're all watching the election returns back in 2004, and he made that speech.
Yeah.
And I said, that guy is going to run for president soon. And
the one before. Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And it turned out, well, he did. But you looked at the other people in the party, and you're like, wow, this guy is a very clear standout. And we all know what happened after that. But Biden is, whether or not Biden has slowed down in any capacity, I don't know if he has or he hasn't. But even Joe Biden of 10 years ago, even Joe Biden as vice president, not particularly inspiring. He's always been folksy. I think he's always been kind of homespun, sort of a down home kind of charm. He's probably good in small groups, maybe one-on-one, but he's never had the capacity to move groups of people. He's never been electrifying. And Trump can occasionally be electrifying.
All right, so we'll say an uncharismatic challenger. Let's go to the economy now, and this is where
very tough. This is very tough.
Well, so let me set this up. Okay, there's strong short-term economy. In other words, it is the economy in a recession, and then here's where I would need to do some more digging. But some people look at this and say, is the economy in recession on election day? Just to set up for folks listening, currently we had negative GDP growth in Q1. We have big negative GDP growth in Q2. So on an annualized basis, minus 32% or something like that. So it dropped 8%. Q3, the Atlanta GDP now has an estimate of plus 26%. So that's what is that divided by 4? Yeah, that's like 7. It's like 6.5%, and then the other one is strong long-term economy. So first of all, and strong long-term economy, I believe in an interview, Professor Lichtman says, has GDP per capita. So that's the GDP growth per people, to put it simply, higher in an incumbent's first term than in the previous 2 terms. So let's start with short term though, because
here's my problem with this. Yes, the numbers are bad. They're very, very bad. But why are they bad? Well, they're bad. They are not bad through systemic failure. They are not bad as the result of inappropriate policy at the Federal Reserve or through legislative or executive action. They are bad because they were self-inflicted. We didn't know how bad the hit was going to be, but we knew it was going to be substantial. Things were humming along very well, and if you're Donald Trump, the worst conceivable time, you have to enact a national shutdown, the like of which has never been seen, and the result of which was at the time unknowable. Well, now we know it was pretty awful, but it was all voluntary and done for the greater good. Now, that doesn't change the fact that businesses were shuttered, people were put out of work. It's bad in that regard. So is a short-term economy strong? No. But is it recovering? Well, if the market is a leading indicator of the underlying economy, which it isn't always, but if it's any indicator, and corporate earnings have remained strong, the large multinationals have remained strong, stocks are surging. I think people were looking down the road that things are going to get better. Things, if I could put this in the middle, I would. It's hard. It's very difficult. If there had been a blunder, right, a policy blunder, yeah, I mean, I think you could give it to Biden, but I don't think that's been the case.
I think you make a compelling argument. I would say I gave this one to Biden, but I don't know. Like if Q3, yeah, if Q3, I mean, for years this is going to mess up our economic charts, right? This will blow away the scale. It's just going to, you're going to have to do logarithmic. Or
I know. You won't be able to.
Yeah,
the dip's going to be too big.
Well, I'm going to give it to Biden. You might give this to Trump. I think on the strict definition, I have to give it to Biden.
Yeah, and that's probably true. I think in reality, it belongs in the middle, but we can't do that. We have to go one way or the other. So I guess this has to go in the Biden column.
Long-term economy. Here's where it gets a little bit interesting. And so I ran the numbers, and prior to coronavirus and Q1. So if I just did this at the end of 2019, Trump's annualized GDP per capita at that point was growing at 8%. Obama, for his 8 years, was something like, plus 2.5%. I forget. The world is different, and now the GDP per capita growth has slipped below the prior two terms in Obama. Now, again, I don't know. If we get this surge in Q3? So Q3, by the way, obviously is July, August, September. This one, I'm more like you on the short term, where I'm kind of like, I don't know, and he could actually regain that growth margin.
I think it's fair to give the short term to Biden. I think it's debatable, but I think by the spirit of how these things are assessed, that has to go in his column. The strong long-term economy, I think, absolutely belongs in the Trump column. Whether or not it helps him is a different story, but I think it belongs in his column.
Let's see where we had a tie on foreign military success. So, okay, so let me count these up. And that last one we did could be the determinant. So if that shifted to Biden, he would have 6. If not, he would have 5. So I don't know if we really it's a coin flip, I think.
I think that's honestly where things are right now.
Yeah.
You mentioned early on that we had a very long discussion in 2016 over what was going to happen. And it was just a couple days before the election, as I recall. And we made some very good points and were very insightful, I'm sure, and very witty. But we both drew the wrong conclusion.
Yeah. And I will say, Professor Lichtman did predict Trump last time, but I believe he was saying Gary Johnson would get 5% or more of the vote because at the time he was polling at 10%. But the reality is for a actually let's not go back on that one. But it's just I think if you go back and redo it, and maybe I'll do that in my spare time, I'm not sure if his keys would have said Trump, because I think he had a third party candidate getting more than 5% of the vote, which would have put it in the challengers column. But okay. I mean, from these keys, I think, it looks like a coin flip.
I think so. Now, look, these are interesting things to consider, and I just feel, and I know he has not set it up this way, but I feel some of these carry far more weight than others. Honestly, with voters. Of course, the economy is always Clinton knew it, and it's always the foremost for people. And this one is a tough read. It's a very tough read.
Spencer, let's talk about, in the remaining time, I want to go to the electoral map, 270 to win. So if you want to do this at home, it's 270-2win.com. And what they do is when you go in there, there's different colors on the map. So it's really deep blue, it's really deep red. Lighter red means it leans. And then you have these brown states.
For those of you scoring at home, Derek and I have been using this since it looked like something made by Yahoo. Been around since the 90s.
Yeah, I mean it's so I go on here and their consensus. So we didn't make any changes, and you can change.
Oh, sure.
So they have currently, so you need 270 electoral votes to win. Right now, they have Biden with 278 before we even change any of the undecideds.
That's tough.
Let's go through this. So let's go through the undecideds. They have Arizona, that funky 1 or 2 electoral votes in Maine and Nebraska, Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And basically, for our purposes, what I did was I said, let's see what the path would be based upon this. If you gave all of those to Republicans, including, oh God, there we go. I'm going to change here. I'll change Maine to all blue, and I'll change Nebraska to all red. It would be 279 to 259, meaning based upon this map, Trump would have to turn one state. So let's turn Wisconsin, and if you turn Wisconsin, it is a tie, which, by the way, would mean the Senate would pick the vice president and the House would pick the president.
Yes, great. That would be great. I would love to see something like that happen. But right now the numbers, like the electoral numbers, don't favor Trump. And I would point out a couple of things. Last time, at this very same time, the numbers were very favorable toward Hillary Clinton, and they remained very favorable up until the day before the election. And you and I had that conversation, and then we said, well, she's not going to win by the margin they think she's going to win by. However, she is going to win because there's just not enough magic. Trump can't draw the royal flush, which he would have to do, and that just doesn't happen. We thought he would do better than the polls said, but we really didn't think he was going to win. In this case, I would say right now, if you look back on a relative basis, Biden is in worse shape than Clinton was at this time.
Oh.
So right now, and historically, Hillary was up 10 points nationally, and she was up, 6 or 7 points, maybe more, in swing states. Biden is only up around 6% nationally. A lot of new polls have come out, which have moved that number down. Of course, I both know that when you see a candidate, whoever they are, up plus 8, 9, 10 nationally, that never holds. That would be a Nixonian level victory over McGovern. That doesn't happen in the modern era. So, but point is, Biden's in a worse position than Clinton was at this time last year. Now, maybe Biden's support is better than Clinton's. I don't know. Turns out Clinton's support was soft, and people didn't turn out. My point is that if you look at some of these states, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania are the most likely states. Maybe Minnesota, though I think it's out of reach. Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Trump can make serious headway. But I have to add a caveat to that. Biden, the only state in which Biden's doing better than Hillary right now, at this time during the election cycle, is Florida. Well, if you're Donald Trump, if you can't win Florida, it's all academic.
Yeah, and to your point, we actually assumed all the toss-ups were going to go to Trump. Obviously, if Arizona goes to Biden, it's a royal flush plus that Trump would have to.
He would need to pull Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin again. I honestly don't think that can happen. What do I know? I didn't think it could happen last time. A lot of this is so tenuous, and the polls, I think, are to be any poll, regardless of whom it favors or who generates the poll, needs to be taken with a grain of salt for this very reason. For these reasons, I should say. First of all, I think people are refusing to be polled now more than ever. So I think it's harder to find people to poll. Second, even if you do poll them and they're likely voters and say, oh yes, I'm going to go vote for Biden or I'm going to go vote for Trump, they don't. They don't go vote. They stay home. And I think that's a phenomenon that's happening. Polls have not been worth a great deal the last several cycles. And voter turnout has been really low because don't forget that Trump won last time with fewer votes than Mitt Romney got.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, you bring up a good point because it's always I've listened to really smart political people on every side of the aisle, and they've always said when people talk about trying to get voters who don't normally vote and win them, it's a lost cause. You have to drive your base. And the Libertarian Party, a lot of people say, why don't you go after the people who don't vote? And the head of the Libertarian Party said, that's not the way this works. You have to get the people who support you to get out. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think I look at this, the electoral map as they've got the consensus. Obviously, they already have Biden winning. And I don't, I think Arizona is just from, I every time I turn on the TV, it's 17 ads in a row. I'm being a little sarcastic. So I know we're in play.
Being in Texas, we are insulated from such things.
Yeah, Texas 270 to win gives it it's lighter shade, but so I don't know. Last time you and I had this conversation, and I agree. I said I didn't think that I thought Hillary had the path. Hillary Clinton had the path. I didn't think Donald Trump had the path on the electoral map.
The interesting thing is Hillary had multiple paths. And the fact that Trump was able to capture the so-called blue wall states shut them all down.
Well, this time I think Trump would have to win Wisconsin, all the other ones, and that vote in Maine that he won last time, and then he can.
But what I think will happen, I think Trump's path to victory, in my opinion, if there is one, maybe there isn't, but if there is one, it is this: you have to have Florida. Okay, Florida is really in contention, and you have to have it. He's going to win North Carolina and Georgia and Ohio, despite the fact that those are all margin of error races right now, but Trump wins all 3 of those states. I think Trump has a very good chance to win Wisconsin. That has to happen. You must turn Wisconsin. And I think the election will turn if Trump can do those things. Believe it or not, to me, the election turns in Nevada.
Nevada's it's light blue.
I think if you can turn Wisconsin, you can turn Nevada. And if you're able, because I think Colorado and New Mexico are 2 gone for Trump. Virginia, Colorado, New Mexico, probably Minnesota and Michigan, you really couldn't do. Maybe you could do Pennsylvania, but I think the resources you could spend in Pennsylvania, of course, Pennsylvania solves all your problems. I don't know that it's possible. But I think Nevada is possible. And I think that if you do that, if you are able to hang on to Florida, you turn Wisconsin and you turn Nevada, you're at 275.
All right. I don't know if I have a prediction that I think it's closer than people think.
Yeah, I'm not predicting that. I'm saying that, to me, if I were to look at an electoral strategy, I think that's the only one that's viable, because I don't think he's going to win Michigan or Minnesota or Pennsylvania or Maine or New Hampshire or Virginia or Colorado or New Mexico. So that really narrows the path that you get to take. And he may not win Florida, and it's going to be an early night. If Joe Biden wins Florida at 9:30 p.m. Eastern time, the election's over. That's it.
Before we come back with final thoughts, the Senate is the other one. I'll go through this quick. There are, obviously, we talked about that construct. Let's say Biden wins, Republicans hold the Senate, Democrats, I don't think there's any debate, are going to hold the House. There are there's probably 6 different Senate seats that are up for grabs. And 270 to win has Montana, Colorado, Iowa, North Carolina, one of them in Georgia, Maine. They've got Arizona. I live in Arizona. I would guess that McSally probably loses, just from the fact that she hasn't won an election yet, right? So she lost to Sinema. I think it's, from what I see here, I give them that. But I don't know. I think, of course, if it's 50-50 and Biden wins, they get the tiebreaker. What are your thoughts on the Senate?
I think that the Senate is going to go to the Democrats. And I think even if Trump wins in my crazy Nevada scenario or some variant thereon, they're still going to lose the Senate.
Yeah, and remember, you can't have 50-50, because if it's 50-50 and Trump stays, then they still have the tiebreaker.
But I don't think they'll be able to get to 50-50.
Yeah, just looking at the map,
it's just not favorable. I mean, and there are times when the electoral map favors the Democrats or favors the Republicans in Congress and in the Senate, and this just does not favor the GOP.
So if I do, and the nice thing about this 270, when you can do this on your own, I'll put the link in the show notes. But in order for Republicans to have 51 versus 49, they've got to win Montana, Georgia, North Carolina, Iowa, and then they lose Arizona, Maine. They lose.
I think they're going to lose the seats in Iowa and North Carolina.
Okay. No, I don't. I think at this point it's close. But when the margin is the margin, you lose a few seats, and
yeah, it's thin as it is.
All right, so I think we agree that there has been some surprising data with regards to investment returns, and I think sometimes, I was going around the country at the time, giving talks in 2016, and I would go to one city, and it would be full, very overly leaning Democrat. Their view was if Trump got in, the world was going to end, the economy was going to crash. I'd go somewhere else, and I'd say if Clinton gets in, then the world's going to crash, the economy's going to crash, the world's going to end. And the reality is, historically, neither are true.
That's true.
And the markets have been very resilient. And so the good news is, there might be pockets that do better or worse. But I will say, though, given the experience so New York had a primary election, I think it was all mail-in. Voting is the voting machines and the apparatus, and it's kind of like your Christmas lights. You go in the garage in December, and then you're like, oh, those lights don't work. Every 2 years or so, they pull out these. I think we could have. I don't know if we might not know on election night, is what I'm saying.
Probably not. I think we almost certainly won't know on election night. I don't think it'll be weeks and weeks later. It'll be a day, I think, at most. But I think there's a chance that if we know on election night, we'll know because Biden has won a decisive victory, and there's no two ways about it.
Oh yeah, if your point on Florida's, by the way, Florida could be tight. I don't think it's going to be that. But yeah, to your point, Florida's on the East Coast. Obviously, that's why we're talking about Florida too. You won't know Hawaii or Alaska results for quite some time. But yeah, I think we could, just from the mail-in standpoint. It's going to, and not every state counts the ballots beforehand. So, for example, Arizona, even before we had coronavirus, when Kirsten Sinema and Martha McSally, their Senate race, I think it was something like a week to 9 days. So you had all these mail-in ballots, right? People might drop them off, or it took them a long time to count them. But I think the good analogy is, it's kind of like if you ran a restaurant and you have 30 tables, but 1,000 people show up for takeout. It's going to be tough to get the orders out. It's going to be tough to count all this stuff on election night. So, we'll kind of see how that works. All right. So you have Biden winning. I know you have the Senate going to the Democrats. Is it going to be Biden or Trump?
If today I have to make a prediction, it's very close, but I have to say that today the advantage is Biden's.
I would agree with that. I think it's obviously the way 270. I'll take 270 win at face value and their consensus. I think it's advantage Biden. I think it's closer than you believe in the Senate. I think there's a chance, but I think 50-50, but obviously it hinges on the White House. Yeah. And last time both of us agreed Hillary Clinton.
Yep.
And it was Trump. So, but we look at this more from a market perspective. And I just think, for people listening, the good news is you can have any number of ways to the makeup of the Senate, the House, and the presidency. And the good news is markets are pretty resilient. We have no idea what's going to happen in the short term, but we'll see. Well, Spencer, thanks for joining us today. And
thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, great job kind of going through everything. And I'll put, for the listeners, I'll put everything in the show notes, and we will, I'll link to 270 win. I'll link to an article where you can take a look at the data that Spencer and I were referring to on the construct and the returns and GDP. And in 4 years, we'll do this again. So I very rarely talk about anything election, and we sort of stay, from an investment standpoint, we stay sort of nonpartisan because it's, we want to look at that. So, all right, Spencer, thanks again for joining us. Great to talk to you, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Derek. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.